Hospitals are places of healing, where science and medicine work to save lives, but they are also places where life and death intertwine, and where the veil between our world and the unknown seems thinnest. In tonight's video, we bring you 6 chilling stories of hospital patients and their family members who experienced the unexplainable, encounters with spirits, visions of loved ones saying goodbye, and eerie moments that defy logic. Whether you're a skeptic or a believer, these tales will make you question what truly happens in those final moments and what lingers afterward. Prepare yourself for a journey into the supernatural. Story number 1. My dad was 62 years old when his health began to decline, particularly his heart. He started experiencing severe chest pains and shortness of breath, which had us all deeply concerned. One day, the pain became unbearable, and he could barely breathe. We rushed him to the hospital, where the doctors acted quickly. They determined he needed open-heart surgery immediately to save his life. The surgery was a success, but it left my dad in a fragile state. He was transferred to the ICU and placed in room 12. To help him recover, he was sedated and put on life support. It was a harrowing time for all of us. Seeing my dad so vulnerable, hooked up to machines and unable to communicate, broke our hearts. A week later, my grandmother flew in from California to see him. She loved my dad deeply. He was her eldest son and the glue that held our family together. When she arrived at the hospital, she went straight to his bedside. Tears streamed down her face as she gently stroked his hair and forehead, whispering words of comfort. Through her sobs, she said, "I'm already old. If I could switch places with you, I would. I would give anything to see you healthy again." Her words were heavy with love and desperation. She stayed by his side for hours, crying and praying. Eventually, my mom arrived to comfort her, holding her as they shared their grief. Miraculously, my dad's condition began to improve over the following days. His breathing stabilized, and the doctors decided to remove the breathing tube. A week later, he was well enough to be transferred out of the ICU to another floor for recovery. After another week in the hospital, my dad was discharged and allowed to come home. We were overjoyed to have him back, and my grandma stayed with us for an additional week to help care for him. She seemed so relieved to see her son recovering, but something about her seemed different, almost as if she was carrying a hidden burden. 2 days before her scheduled flight back to California, my grandma suddenly complained of a sharp headache. She became nauseous and started vomiting uncontrollably. Alarmed, we rushed her to the same hospital where my dad had been treated. The doctors quickly diagnosed her with a ruptured artery in her brain, an aneurysm. She was rushed into surgery, but the damage was severe. After the surgery, she was placed on life support and transferred to the ICU. To our shock, they placed her in the same room where my dad had been, room 12. That night, despite the doctor's best efforts, my grandmother passed away. It was devastating to lose her so suddenly, especially after she had been so strong for my dad during his time of need. As we sat in the waiting room, numb with grief, her words from the hospital replayed in my mind. "If I could switch places with you, I would." In a way, it felt like she had done exactly that. She had taken his place, sacrificing herself so that he could live. The timing, the circumstances, and even the shared hospital room felt like more than just coincidence. It was as if she had willed her love for my dad into a final act of selflessness. My dad was heartbroken, but also deeply grateful for the time my grandmother gave him to recover. To this day, Room 12 holds a special, bittersweet significance for us, a place of both despair and profound love. Story number 2. My dad had been a heavy smoker for most of his life, and at 64 years old, he was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. The news hit our family hard, but my dad seemed to take it in stride. He was stoic, accepting the diagnosis without much complaint. One day, things took a sharp turn. He began coughing up blood and struggled to breathe. We rushed him to the hospital, where the doctors ran tests and held meetings with us to discuss his options. After 2 consultations, my dad made a decision. He didn't want to continue with treatments. He told us he was tired and wanted to spend whatever time he had left in peace. The nurses transferred him to another floor for palliative care. It was an older part of the hospital with shared rooms, and my dad was assigned to room 28. When we arrived, we saw that the bed near the window was already occupied by an older man. My dad was given the bed near the door. We didn't know much about the other patient or why he was there, but the room was quiet and we hoped it would be a peaceful place for my dad to rest. That evening, as the hospital settled into its nighttime rhythm, I stayed by my dad's side. Around 9 p.m., he started to complain. "Why is his wife crying so much?" he asked, sounding irritated. "She keeps crying to him, and he's not even dead yet. It's so annoying." Luckily, my father doesn't speak much English, so he said that in our language. His comment took me by surprise. I looked over at the other bed, but it was just the other patient, lying still with his eyes closed. There was no one else there. "Dad," I said gently, "there's no one crying. It's just the 2 of you in here." But he wouldn't let it go. "No," he insisted. "His wife is right there, sitting next to him, crying and crying. Tell the nurse to move me. I can't sleep with all that noise." I tried to calm him down, reminding him again that there was no one else in the room. He shook his head, visibly frustrated, but eventually he grew quiet and drifted off into a restless sleep. I stayed with him through the night, keeping an eye on him in the room. Nothing unusual happened, and the other patient remained still and silent. The next morning, at around 7:30 a.m., the quiet was broken when a woman entered the room. She looked to be in her late 30s or early 40s, and her eyes were red from crying. She walked straight to the other patient's bed and sat down beside him. Through her tears, she said softly, "Dad, Mom didn't wake up this morning. She passed away in her sleep at home." My heart stopped. I stared at her, then at the other patient, and then at my dad, who was still asleep. Her words sent chills down my spine. Could my dad have somehow known? Could he have sensed her presence? The grief of a wife who had just passed away, perhaps saying goodbye to her husband one last time? I didn't say anything to the woman or my dad. I didn't know how to explain it, or if I even should. All I knew was that what my dad experienced wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was as if he had witnessed something that the rest of us couldn't see, a connection between 2 souls at the edge of life and death. That moment stayed with me, a haunting reminder of the mysteries we may never fully understand. Life and death are closer than we think, and sometimes the boundary between the 2 blurs in ways that leave us questioning everything we thought we knew. Story number 3. My mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, but by the time they discovered it, it was already too late. The cancer had spread aggressively to her other organs, leaving little room for hope. Despite the grim prognosis, my mother chose to proceed with treatments, even though many doctors advised against it. They warned that the treatments might make her so sick they could hasten her death, rather than prolong her life. She began chemotherapy, but the side effects hit her hard. After the first session, she became incredibly ill, so weak and lethargic that I couldn't wake her up. Although she was still breathing, I panicked and called 911. The paramedics arrived quickly and rushed her to the hospital. The next day, the doctor gathered my siblings and me to discuss her condition. He explained that her organs were failing and there was nothing more they could do to save her. It was heartbreaking, But we made the painful decision to sign a Do Not Resuscitate (DNR) order. We wanted her final days to be as peaceful as possible, without the added pain of invasive procedures. Family members began arriving at the hospital to say their goodbyes. My mother was deeply loved, and the room was filled with emotion as everyone shared their final moments with her. As a school teacher, my summer workload was light, so I volunteered to stay overnight with her. That evening, around 10 p.m., the nurse and CNA came by to change my mother for the night. They turned off the main lights, leaving only the soft glow of the sink light to illuminate the room. I settled into the recliner at the foot of her bed, scrolling through my phone until exhaustion took over. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I was startled awake by the sound of movement. Opening my eyes, I saw my mother standing beside her bed. My heart raced. She had been bedridden for weeks, too weak to even sit up on her own. Yet here she was, standing steadily, looking as if she had regained her strength. I jumped out of the recliner and rushed to her side, holding her hand to steady her. "Mom, what are you doing? You shouldn't be out of bed. Where are you going?" She looked at me with a calm, almost serene expression. "Son," she said softly, "I'm going to go. Your father and the others might not wait for me if I don't go now." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to hold her back, to stop her, but my phone suddenly rang, pulling me out of what I now realized was a dream. It was so vivid, so real, that it took me a moment to remember where I was. The call was from my sister. Her voice was trembling as she spoke, tears evident in every word. "I just had a dream about Mom," she said. "She came to say goodbye. Is she okay?" Before I could respond, I noticed the nurse by my mother's bedside, listening to her chest with a stethoscope. The nurse turned to me with a somber expression and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Vang. Your mother passed in her sleep." It was 3 a.m. I told my sister to come to the hospital and called the rest of our siblings. We didn't notify anyone else, wanting this quiet moment to be just for our family. After an hour of sitting with her, sharing stories, and comforting one another, we decided to leave. The nurses assured us they would take care of her, preparing her to be moved to the morgue. That night was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. My mother's words, her calm demeanor in the dream, and my sister's simultaneous vision left no doubt in my mind that the spirit world is real. She had come to say goodbye to both of us in her own way, leaving behind a memory that would forever strengthen my belief in the existence of something beyond this life. Story number 4. My aunt was only 54 years old, but she struggled with severe heart problems for much of her life. Despite numerous treatments, her condition worsened, and she was admitted to the hospital while waiting for a heart transplant. Everyone in the family was hopeful that she would get a second chance at life once a suitable donor was found. One day, while she was still in the hospital, she went into cardiac arrest. The medical staff rushed into her room, working frantically to save her. As they fought to revive her, my aunt's husband called my dad to let him know what was happening. My dad, who doesn't speak English well, asked me to come along to the hospital to help communicate. We hurried to the hospital, but by the time we arrived, the situation had taken a tragic turn. After 30 minutes of intense effort, the medical team was unable to bring her back. A doctor came out to inform us that my aunt had passed away. The words hit like a thunderclap. She was gone. Afterward, the hospital staff gently bathed her for the final time, preparing her body for the family to say goodbye. Following our tradition, the elders brought her traditional funeral clothing to dress her in. These customs are deeply meaningful, helping to guide the spirit to its next journey. As the elders worked, the atmosphere in the room was somber, filled with quiet sobs, and the rustle of fabric. Then, my youngest uncle arrived. He was the closest to my aunt out of all the siblings, and his arrival felt like a heavy wave of emotion crashing over the room. He rushed to her side, tears streaming down his face as he stroked her forehead. Through his sobs, he said, "I'm so sorry. I lived so far away and couldn't make it in time. Why were you in such a hurry? Why didn't you wait for me to come see you?" His words broke something inside me. The pain in his voice, the guilt in his words, it was too much. I quietly slipped out of the room, unable to bear the weight of the moment. I stood in the hallway, trying to compose myself, when something strange happened. The crying and murmuring from the room suddenly stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. And then I heard her voice, my aunt's voice. Clear as day, she spoke. "My brother, it's okay. You're already here. Please don't cry." My heart froze. I wasn't the only one who heard it. Moments later, one of the elders stepped out of the room, his face pale. He told me to go find a doctor immediately. I rushed to the nurse's station and explained what was happening. A nurse followed me back to the room to assess the situation. By the time we got there, my aunt was lying peacefully on the bed again, as if nothing had happened. The nurse checked for any signs of life, but found none. No heartbeat, no breathing. My uncle insisted that we bring a doctor. The nurse went to fetch one, and soon a doctor arrived to assess her again. After a thorough check, the doctor confirmed once more that she was gone. The room fell into a heavy silence, but the weight of what had just happened lingered. My uncle, shaken but calmer now, sat beside her and held her hand, tears still streaming down his face. To this day, I can't explain what happened. How could she have spoken to my uncle after she had passed? Was it her spirit lingering for a moment, trying to comfort the brother she had been so close to in life? Or was it something beyond our understanding, something that defies logic and reason? It remains one of the most extraordinary and inexplicable moments of my life. I don't know if it was a gift, a final goodbye, or something else entirely. But one thing is certain: the love my aunt had for her family transcended even death, leaving us with a memory we will never forget. Story number 5. My dad was diagnosed with cancer in his large intestine. The news devastated us, but we rallied around him as a family, determined to support him through his treatment. He began chemotherapy, and though it was grueling, he handled it with strength and optimism. However, the doctors eventually decided that removing his entire large intestine was the best course of action. After the surgery, he had to use an ostomy bag, which was attached to his side for waste. For a while, things seemed to be looking up. He adjusted to life with the ostomy bag and was even starting to feel like himself again. But 7 months later, he started complaining of severe pain in his lower back. At first, we thought it might be from overexertion or something unrelated, but the pain didn't go away. Concerned, we took him to his doctor, who ran some tests and drew blood. The results were alarming. The doctor told us he needed to go to the ER immediately. Once there, further tests revealed that the cancer had spread to both of his kidneys. Hearing this news felt like the ground had been ripped out from under us. They put my dad back on chemotherapy, but this time, the treatment seemed to take a much greater toll on him. He became weaker with each session. One day he told us he didn't want to continue the treatments anymore. He was tired of the pain, the hospital visits, and the endless battle that never seemed to end. He just wanted to go home. By this point, my dad was so frail he could no longer walk on his own. The hospital arranged to send a hospital bed to our house, which we set up in the living room, so he could be comfortable and surrounded by family. A week later, life felt strangely normal despite the heavy atmosphere in our home. my wife and I kept to our usual routine. She worked the early shift, starting at 4 a.m., while I began at 6 a.m. That evening, we went to bed at 8 p.m., as usual. My wife quickly fell asleep, but I stayed awake scrolling on my phone. The hospital bed had a small speaker installed, allowing us to check in on my dad without disturbing him. At around 10:30 p.m., I called through the speaker to see if he was okay. He responded softly, saying he had just turned off the TV and was about to sleep. He assured me not to worry about him and told me to get some rest since I had work the next morning. Feeling reassured, I stayed up a little longer, but by 11 p.m., I decided it was time to sleep. Before heading to bed, I got up to use the bathroom in the hallway and decided to check on my dad one last time. The living room was dimly lit, but I could see his figure in the bed. I stood there for a moment, watching his chest to make sure he was breathing. Something felt off. His chest wasn't rising or falling. I turned on the light and immediately noticed his face. It was pale, his mouth slightly open. Panic set in as I touched his hand. It was cold. Frantically, I called 911. When the paramedics arrived, they examined him and told me something that sent chills through my entire body. They estimated that he had passed away around 8 p.m., right when my wife and I had gone to bed. They explained that his body was already cold, and rigor mortis had set in, which takes several hours to develop. I was stunned. How could this be? I told them I had spoken to him through the speaker at 10:30 p.m. His voice had been clear, calm, and reassuring. Yet they insisted that based on his physical condition, he had been gone for hours by that point. To this day, I can't explain what happened. How could I have heard my dad's voice after he had already passed? Was it his way of comforting me one last time to let me know he was at peace? Or was it something beyond explanation, a phenomenon I'll never fully understand? Losing my dad that night was heartbreaking, but what happened will always leave me with questions. I like to believe that his love for us was so strong that he found a way to say goodbye, even after his physical body was no longer here. Story number 6. In 2013, while mopping the kitchen, I slipped and fell hard on the floor, breaking my right hip. The pain was unbearable, and I ended up in the hospital for 4 days. After undergoing surgery, I was sent to a rehabilitation facility to regain my strength and mobility. The facility was divided into 2 sections, one for long-term residents and the other for short-term rehabilitation patients like me. I was placed on the short-term side in room 5, sharing it with a kind elderly gentleman named Robert. Robert was friendly, and having him as a roommate made my first couple of days there more bearable. However, on the second day, Robert was discharged and went home. That night I found myself alone in the room. Around 11 p.m., a nurse came in to give me my medication. She checked my vitals, chatted briefly, and then left, closing the door behind her. My bed faced the bathroom door, and along the wall next to it were 2 visitor chairs. After the nurse left, I spent about 20 minutes scrolling through my phone before feeling drowsy. I turned off my phone, slid it under my pillow, and closed my eyes, ready for sleep. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard the distinct sound of someone sitting down on one of the chairs. The faint creak of the chair and the rustle of movement were unmistakable. My eyes shot open, and there she was, a frail, elderly woman with long white hair, dressed in a white hospital gown. She sat on the chair closest to the bathroom wall, staring directly at me. Her face was shrouded in shadows, and I couldn't make out her features clearly. A cold chill ran down my spine as I realized I couldn't move or speak. My body felt completely paralyzed, yet my mind was fully awake. I tried to convince myself I was dreaming, but it all felt too vivid, too real. The woman slowly stood up and shuffled toward Robert's now empty bed. I watched helplessly as she lay down, her thin frame sinking into the mattress. She turned her head toward the ceiling and remained still, her eyes fixed upward. I wanted to scream or call for help, but my voice wouldn't come, and my body refused to respond. I don't know how long I stared at her, unable to look away. At some point, everything went black. The next thing I knew, I woke up at 4:30 a.m. There was a cold, wet sensation on my forehead and under my arms. Ice packs had been placed there. A nurse came in and told me I spiked a fever of 101 during the night. She said they'd been monitoring me closely because I had started sweating profusely and mumbling incoherently in my sleep. I couldn't remember when I'd fallen asleep or what had happened after I saw the woman, but I was certain of one thing. It wasn't a dream. The memory of her sitting in the chair and lying on Robert's bed was too vivid to dismiss. Later that morning, I informed the staff that I wanted to go home. They tried to persuade me to stay for a few more days to complete my rehabilitation, but I refused. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling of what had happened in room 5, and I wasn't willing to spend another night there. Even now, I can't explain what I saw. Was it a fever-induced hallucination? Or was there truly someone, or something, else in that room with me? All I know is that it left me with a chilling memory I'll never forget. That's all the stories for this video. For those who enjoy stories like mine, we have another new channel that have a mix of Southeast Asian scary ghost stories and stories that takes place right here in America. Check it out. The channel is currently called Hmong Horror Story. The link to the channel is in the description box. Thank you, and I'll see you in another video.